Welcome back, everyone, and thank you for staying with us through the break. Let's make the most of our final session together. So, in our final session, we will hear global perspective on climate leadership and nature-based solutions. We are delighted to host Bruna Cerqueira, General Coordinator of the Action Agenda COP30 Presidency. Bruna is leading national and international engagement ahead of the United Nations Climate Change Conference in Belém 2025. She has extensive experience in multilateral climate negotiations and previously supported Brazil's climate diplomacy at the Brazilian Climate Center. Bruna will discuss how businesses can support biodiversity, enable inclusive transitions, and align with national and global climate goals. She will be moderated by Dr. Theseira and Karina Litvack. Please welcome Bruna Cerqueira, Dr. Theseira, and Karina Litvack.
Thank you very much. Welcome, everyone. We're going to have a slight tweak to the plan, which is that I am going to ask the questions. Gary will monitor your questions and jump in to make sure that we take proper account of the questions that you have. So we'll be, sort of team tagging each other and make sure that we give as much space as possible to Bruna. Because she is the star of today's show. So welcome, Bruna. We're so honored to have you here today. For the benefit of the audience, I'm just going to run through very quickly what the 4 questions are that we have, so that if you have questions that relate to a later question in the series, you know it's coming. Obviously, don't hesitate to type up any questions you have. Gary will throw them at us. But just very quickly, the first bucket of questions is going to be on the expectations for COP30. Obviously, no surprise there. And in particular, what Brazil is going to do differently and what its priorities are. We're then going to turn to the NDC response, the nationally determined contributions, and what came out of the UN General Assembly week last week. So Bruna is going to walk us through Brazil's expectations based on what happened last week. We're going to talk about also some of the headwinds that we are facing coming out of the United States. And within that are some issues around collaboration. So many of you will recall, actually, I'll leave that for the actual question. And then we'll conclude with a focus on nature and biodiversity, and in particular, some of the challenges we're facing right now with the rollback in the EU Deforestation Directive, and what that means for the rest of the world, and particularly the Global South, what opportunities that creates for, initiative to be taken in the Global South. So with that, Bruna, are you comfortable with that before we jump in? Okay, great. So let's go straight into question 1. So Brazil is in the hot seat. You are in the hot seat as the leader for Brazil's contribution to COP30. And tell us what Brazil is going to be doing differently from past COP presidencies, and walk us through what your priorities are for Brazil, for the emerging world, for adaptation, which is obviously a key concern, and for technology transfer from north to south.
Hello, first of all, it is really a pleasure to be with you. It is very nice to meet you, Karina and Dr. Gary. It's great to be with you today, and really, really an honor to be able to participate in this event and to be talking to all of you. So looking forward not only to share, but also to the questions and hopefully comments from you as well. We're very much at COP30 building this COP in listening mode, and building this COP truly in the spirit of the Multiro, which is a Brazilian indigenous words to basically say that it is something that is collectively built. It's for all of us to build together. There is no results that Brazil can bring to the table alone, and really we hope that we'll be able to do this together. So I'm working at the COP30 presidency team with a particular task around what's called the action agenda, which is the piece of COP30 that is looking at the voluntary commitments from everyone, from the countries, from the subnational governments, from the private sector, from civil society. So this is a part of the wider effort of COP. But maybe to go back on the question and look at the wider priorities that Brazil has as presidency for this COP, we're working with 3 key topics that are really guiding us in the way that we're doing this. The first is to protect multilateralism. I think we're all seeing the challenges that we're facing today. And we think that it is more than ever really important to protect this space. We cannot deal with this challenge of climate change, everyone alone. It is impossible to deal with it if not in the context of multilateralism. And multilateralism has been working for this. So, it's not going fast enough. That is very true. But if we look at the last 10 years of the Paris Agreement, when we started this process, we were on a global trajectory to over 4 degrees of rise in temperatures. And we have reduced this today to around 2.7, by far not sufficient to what we need, but definitely we see that this process is working, so we do need to protect it. The second thing that we are working in terms of key objectives for this COP is to accelerate implementation. So you've been hearing us talking a lot about this. There's been many COPs that have talked about being the implementation COP, but we truly think that this is the moment now, after closing what is called the rule book, the point of negotiations, that we do need a turning point to implementation. And I'll talk through a little bit how we're thinking about doing this. And the third key objective for this COP is to bring closer the climate discussions to people's real lives. We feel like there's a real disconnect between what is happening in the negotiations, in the process, and how people feel that it affects their lives. It is very difficult to relate to, how this affects their day-to-day. So we do want to bring those things closer. We're working on the 4 pillars of the process of COP. There's the political process with the leader summit, where you have the heads of states. There's the negotiations, which is the heart of the process. There is the action agenda, which is the piece that I'm working on about these voluntary commitments and all of the actors. And we've added one from Brazil's side, which is the mobilization. As you know, Brazil has a very big tradition around social mobilization, around social participation, and we wanted this COP to reflect that tradition, to be that, to be the COP of people, to be the COP of everyone. This is something that President Lula has been speaking constantly. So I think we're looking at those, high-level objectives across the board in terms of how we deal with it. And maybe to set out a little bit of where I am sitting in this piece of the action agenda, we think that this can be really in how we're doing things differently, let's say. If we are focusing on implementation, we think that this requires a real response around how do we move the process to that implementation phase. And the action agenda is one instrument that has been working in that way, but that can be much more in terms of what we do with it in the next 10 years. We think that in the first 10 years of the Paris Agreement, it has been very important to bring all of the stakeholders in. So we see a real difference from Paris to now in terms of how many businesses, how many subnational governments are a part of this movement. I think if you've been to Paris and the way that it was designed, it was a much smaller space, the COPs, and it has grown. And it has grown because people do want to come in and to be a part of it. But looking into the next 10 years, we think that there is a couple of things that we can do differently that we're trying to set out with this COP that can help us advance in that way. The first is that we want to create consistency in the way that we are shaping the topics and the agenda for all of these stakeholders to come in. So what has happened in the last years is that each COP presidency would define its priorities, and it's very natural, right? Every country has priorities that it wants to put in play. But that has created a space that's very difficult for the businesses to engage. It's always, renewing, and it's always bringing something new. So we want to create a little bit of stability in that and really connecting it to what's coming out of the negotiations. So we have set out a framework for the action agenda that is entirely based on the Global Stocktake, on the results of the first Global Stocktake that came out of Dubai. And we think that this is something that can continue over time, because if in the Paris Agreement we have those 5-year cycles where the countries present their NDCs, and the Global Stocktake is the tool that we have to assess how well we're doing in terms of the implementation of the Paris Agreement, we think that we can connect that to be the basis of the framework that we put together. And so if you have seen the fourth letter of President André Correia do Lago, we have set out 6 axes and 30 key objectives that we're working with for this COP. So an axis on energy, industry, and transport, an axis on nature, so on forest, biodiversity, oceans, an axis on agriculture and food systems, a fourth axis on cities, infrastructure, water, a fifth axis on social and human development, and one that is cross-cutting our 6 axis around finance, technology, and capacity building. This is quite broad and quite encompassing, but it is a translation of the 196 paragraphs that the Global Stocktake gave us. And so it tells us everything we need to do, triple renewables, double energy efficiency. We think that where we're at now is that we just need to deliver on that. And that becomes our implementation tool. So that is the first piece of how we're looking to change things, create that consistency in the way that that's our guidance of implementation. The second way that we want to shift things a little bit and do it a little bit differently is that we don't want to reinvent the wheel. And so we don't want to come to the table with initiatives that Brazil is putting on the table, and then the next year, no one really knows what happens with them. We want to start from what's already there. So we have been working very closely together with our high-level champion and the high-level champion from Azerbaijan, Nigar Padaray. And the team of the high-level champions has really helped us in doing an all-encompassing mapping of what were the initiatives that were launched over the past 10 years. And this has gotten us to over 600 initiatives. And these are things like ICVCM, VCMI on carbon markets. You know, there's a whole range of initiatives, a lot of them. We've invited them all in, and they are, we have around, I think, almost 400 that said yes to our invitation and that are a part of the efforts with us. And they are forming what we're calling activation groups on each of the 30 key objectives. So they're really helping us build these results in the spirit of the Multiro, us all doing together. And so the focus is really on delivery, on delivering of results, and not necessarily about creating the shining new thing. So I think these are the 2 key ways in which we're doing things differently. And I'm happy to jump in and explore a bit more on the specific topics. You've talked about nature, you've talked about technology. Those are really key topics for us. But maybe I'll hand it back to you, and I'll let you guide us through those questions. Adaptation is definitely a big one for us, and something that we want this COP to be elevating adaptation so that it's in the same level of mitigation, that we're not, you know, again, focusing in an unbalanced way.
Got it. Well, as you would say, parabéns. This is, which for those of you who don't speak Portuguese, and I don't, is bravo, because this is an incredibly ambitious but also very thoughtful agenda. My one suggestion would be, right now, the chatter on COP30 is all about hotel space. Could we shift it away from that to the substance of what you are doing? Because it really is incredibly impressive. And we need to do a better job of really inspiring people to appreciate the incredible work that you have put into making this, this COP really make a difference. We'll come back to the questions that you alluded to in the next questions, and possibly our audience will also pinpoint the ones that it particularly wants to hear. I'd like to invite you now to tell us what your takeaways were from New York last week at so-called UNGA Week, UN General Assembly, besides the broken escalator. What were the important things that came out of that week in respect of making sure that COP30 really delivers?
No, thank you for that. And thank you for the comment of the hotels. Please, this is exactly what we need, to shift away and focus on what we need to focus. I think it has been getting better too. I know these questions will come on the hotel situation. It has been getting better. I think over time, the prices are going down, and we've been dealing with quite specific cases now and trying to get this to work. So hopefully we can focus on the substance indeed. And yes, I've just come back from New York on Saturday, and it has been very exciting, to be honest. I think that we were all, questioning, will this be, how will the spirit be in New York? And I've learned from the colleagues in the climate group that this has been the biggest New York Climate Week ever, which was a surprise. I think there was questions if people were going, if that was still going to be the case. And so it was. And really the spirit that we saw in the different rooms that the different parts of the team were in was a spirit of pragmatism. I think people were really on the table to talk about the real solutions, the things that were happening, and how can we advance. I think the key phrase was climate positive growth. This was running across all of the rooms. It is not now about, going and making a lot of noise. It's not about, the stage and the logic of, coming and making those bold statements. It is about the pragmatism in how we do this, the pragmatism of how this fits businesses, fits people's, fits development processes. And so this has been very inspiring, actually, to see across the rooms. Of course, the centerpiece of this was the NDC summit that President Lula held with Secretary General of the UN, Guterres. And again, I think in that we were seeing a real delay in the way that the NDCs were being presented. We had the deadline in February. Most of the countries were late to come to the table. I think we still have to see the NDCs that are coming, but the summit itself was really inspiring to see the leaders taking the stage and continuing to make those statements about the importance of this to their economies, the importance of this to their development. I think this was quite striking in the speeches and the narratives. And we've seen especially President Xi Jinping coming to the table with its expected NDC, its expected contribution for China, which for the first time will take a reduction over the peak year. So that was quite good to see, and very important leadership in the way that is set out. We have seen, I think it was over 120 countries that have asked for the leaders to take the stage and take these statements. So although we still don't have a lot of the NDCs, I think we still have to keep tabs and to keep the conversation going about the NDCs coming before COP. I think it has generated real momentum in terms of getting us closer to where we need to be in terms of the receiving the NDCs. Of course, a part of the conversation was about the gaps. So we will see, and we are seeing a gap in ambition, which is part of the conversation, right, of what's coming in these NDCs. But we're also seeing gaps of implementation, and I was part of a dinner with WRI that we talked about a number of gaps in courage, gaps in, the way that we need to go about this. But implementation, I think, is key. And I think the way that we're looking at it is that implementation generates implementation, and the way that we need to think about how to cover that gap in very smart ways. So a lot of the countries coming to the table also with suggestions about how we go about this. How do we enable that implementation to go faster? What are the things that are blocking that, faster investments, faster progress in the way that we're doing this? And I think that is the centerpiece of the conversation now, the solutions that are coming to the table for us to be able to do that faster. That was also a very important part of the week. So ahead of the summit on the NDCs, the Secretary General, with our support, held a number, I think around 10, what was called solutions dialogues, from topics like early warning systems to methane, to energy transition, to industry transition. There were a number of solutions dialogues with ministers, with private sector coming to the table and really focusing on what are the solutions that we need to put in place, or the solutions that we already have and that we need to scale up in order to be able to tackle this challenge. So I think this is my main takeaway, that inspiration and that real pragmatism and focus on how do we unlock the faster progress that we need on those solutions. and coming up with those answers together.
It's
May I
so
jump in?
interesting what you said. Oh, did you say Gary, do you have questions coming from the audience?
No, I didn't have any questions, but before we got too far along, I thought I might want to come in with a little bit of request for clarification on all these things. I really take the on the idea that, you know, it's been 10 years since the Paris Agreement, and yes, we have been sort of ironing out the last of the rules and modalities that we brought up, you know, with the closure of Article 6, and then finally getting some movement on loss and damage. But when you mentioned the sort of 6 areas that you were focusing on, and the last one being finance, technology transfer, and capacity building, that immediately then triggered in my mind, you know, the idea that you know, we've had, as you mentioned, a number of quote unquote implementation COPs. And particularly when you start talking about gaps, the big one that jumps out almost every COP is of course finance and the means of implementation that you know, current events notwithstanding, and aid drying up notwithstanding, you still have to be realistic about the dilution of the means of implementation across the loss and damage fund, the adaptation fund, you know, and many others. So, you know, just getting back to that question about how you're trying to approach this differently, and the ways in which you're talking now about the solution dialogues, I think, which are very, very important, is getting over this particular technology transfer finance gap, one of the areas that is going to be focused on in terms of solutions. Thank you so much. Obrigado.
If I may comment on that, absolutely. I think that's something that we are seeing, and that's why we're trying to work across all of these, let's say, buckets that I've talked about, right? So negotiations, action agenda, it all has to work in a way that is complementing each other. And we have those instruments in place, and indeed, we're not going fast enough. But what we have in this COP on the finance space in particular is the expectation of what happens with the roadmap to 1.3 trillion, right? What came out of last year in Baku, there was an agreement that there would be 300 billion would be the floor to what developed countries should enable raising to developing countries. But on top of that, the Brazilian presidency and the Azerbaijani presidency together would come up by the COP with a roadmap to raise this to 1.3 trillion. So there is a piece of the need for mobilization of the public funds that is definitely a part of the political discussion and the political debate about what needs to be, you know, replenished in these funds. But there is also a conversation about how do we raise more than that, and what are the instruments for that. So we've had a few rounds of consultations on this. And what we've also done differently, because, you know, we Brazilians like to create the things, we've created a few circles of ministers, a few circles to topic areas that we thought were really important to politically position in the debate. And one of these circles is the circle of finance ministers. So bringing together finance ministers that could contribute to that discussion about the 1.3. It won't be the only contribution, but it will be one very important contribution. And we think that this is a key way in which we shift the conversation, because the climate negotiations are led by the climate ministers and the climate negotiators, but they don't really have the tools in their tool set to deal with a lot of the economic mechanisms that we do need to be a part of this process. So we think it's quite interesting that we open that space and that we look at that from a wider economic perspective. And then there are things in there like, you know, new creative instruments of finance, like we're seeing, and we will go into the forest bit in a bit, but you've seen Brazil sponsoring the TFFF, the Tropical Forest Forever Fund, which is not only relying on public, you know, donations and the the aid finance mechanisms, but that's trying to create a revolving fund that is about investments, that is about, investments that can benefit the forest and that can be sustainable over time. You've also seen discussions around, for example, the platforms, the country platforms, about how do we enable investments into our economies, and this is investable NDCs, investable NAPs. How do we progress on that front of attracting the private capital, de-risking that capital, bringing the lower cost of capital for our countries in the areas where investment is possible. So I think it is that widening of that conversation into something that is more productive and that doesn't put us in that, it's either, we're waiting for the finance to do something that we need to do. We all need to adapt. We need to adapt fast. We know that the cost of inaction on adaptation in particular is only going to raise all of our costs on this. So we need to bring this forward. And this is in the interest of all countries. It is not because, the money hasn't come in full that our needs are not there. So we need to progress on that. And I think that's the real spirit of pragmatism, right? What can we do now and what can we do for ourselves that is going to take us forward?
Okay, let's jump straight to the final question, then come back to the third one, because you've alluded to investing in nature and forests and so forth. So let's build on that. I mean, we did note earlier that the EU deforestation directive, which had set a very ambitious standard, is now being diluted and delayed. Do you want to comment a little bit on the implications that has for not just Brazil, but for the whole of the developing world, in particular those that are major suppliers of timber? Actually, Canada is one of them too. But and whether you see the opportunity for regional responses to compensate for that. And as we say, when God closes a door, she opens a window. How can we make this into the window that she opens?
No, thank you for that. And you will know that Brazil was never a big fan of that directive, of the what is so-called the unilateral measures and the logic of, creating regulation. And but regardless, I think it is about the movement of, pushing back a little bit on the way that we go about these things. But there are a number of instruments for forest, and this is, I think, the real story that we want to put forward in this COP. On the forest space, as as Malaysia, Brazil that's a very dear topic to Brazil, and that is something that we do want to raise up. And we think that there are a few different things that we can do on this. So yes, there is a point about how do we discuss the space of what does it mean to be deforestation free? How do you create consistency in the market rules? So a bit of harmonization of that, so that it's not, only at and there are different directives today, some that are responsive to legislation, to local legislation, which for us is very important, for example, that you highlight and that you value the local legislations. In the case of Brazil, we have a very strong legislation on forest, which is the Forest Code. That is something that we feel should be acknowledged and should be a part of the conversation. But there is also a whole array of instruments around incentives. And we think that that's what the bits that we need to shift the economy in that sense. How is it making sense from an economic perspective as a producer for you to invest in that shift in the way that you produced, in the way that you are that you're holding the space? In the case of Brazil, the legislation is a big piece of this. So, for example, in the Amazon area, as a producer, you need to preserve 80% of your property space. And that is, for the producers, a very important cost and a very important, contribution that they're giving already to this process. And then what you do on top of that is something that you need to have some kind of incentive that will be responsive to the way that this is being purchased in different markets. So we think that it opens a space for that conversation about the incentive side measures. How does markets actually value those commodities that are produced more sustainably? And there are a number of different guidelines that are developed about this, and that has to be and continue to be a part of the conversation. It has to be for the consumers. It has to be something that is giving them confidence that what they're consuming is not coming from deforested areas. But where it is produced, it needs to make sense for the producers. There needs to be a balance about, the cost of production and how it makes sense for them to shift the way that they're producing. And we think that this is about a basket of economic instruments that need to be in place for that to really make sense from an economic perspective, right? Any investors, they're not going to invest if there's no return on investment. So I think we need to think with the same mindset of how are we balancing the economic accounting of this for this process. And hopefully this will bring about conversation about what is fit for purpose in that space, also in terms of legislation and the regulation and the harmonization of regulation. I think that this is a topic that is cutting across a number of different areas, not only the forest and production, but and carbon markets, for example, something that is helping the markets be more efficient in that way. So harmonizing a bit of the rules and how we are and how we're bringing these things together and creating consistency also for the investors in the way that this is taken forward.
Yeah, I do have a question that's come up. David Tay has written in, and it's fairly long paragraph, and some of the questions actually you've already addressed in your present response. But there's something here right towards the end. How will Brazil at COP30 help clarify or define some standards or pathways for companies, especially those operating in Amazon product-linked supply chains, to deliver just, equitable, I guess, science-aligned and nature-positive transition plans? I do know it's a big question because it covers sort of the just transition and also covers alignment with the science, which can be something that depending on what science we're looking at, could be a long discussion. But the nature positive transition plans, I think, for too long we've been operating with some of the sort of Western narratives, particularly surrounding the concept of additionality that sort of talks about the fact that apart from harboring biodiversity, mature forests are at a level of, I guess, equilibrium, and don't actually sequester additional carbon. And I think that there's a growing body of evidence that actually suggests that forests that are at climax, at equilibrium, are actually exporting carbon, through rivers, in the waters that come out of them. They're exporting carbon in the form of living animals that actually move in and out of the forest, and they carry carbon with them. Are there any initiatives that Brazil is going to bring forward that will help update some of the areas where information is kind of stuck in these older narratives? Because the main idea, obviously, is to give forests greater value standing than harvested or in the form of commodities or products. Obrigado.
No, thank you for that. And I think this is a bit where Brazil is not alone going to put this on the table. And I've talked a little bit about our approach of working with the initiatives on the forest space. There are many, many initiatives that have been working on this in the past years, and we do want to build on them. It's initiatives like on regenerative agriculture, initiatives like the Forest and Climate Leaders Partnership, but also a number around JRED and about restoration. So I think there is a point about the reliance on instruments like the REDD+ instrument, which is very important, and it does work for areas where you have, pressures about deforestation. But it doesn't work in every area. So I think this is what you said. What we're looking at much more now is about that composition of the basket that you need. In different areas and different realities will need different instruments that can support that. So we see that, for restoration, there's a real business case for that. There's real returns on investments, and that is a type of forest protection that you can really rely on carbon markets, for example, to accelerate much faster. The areas where you have pressure, you can use the REDD+ is a very important instrument, and it needs to be strengthened, and it needs to create some confidence around it. And I think there is a point about the credibility of the instruments that is very important to be pushed, and there are a number of initiatives that are doing that. But then there's a piece of this that isn't covered, and that's why the logic of the Tropical Forest Forever Fund, which we think are areas where you have high forest, low deforestation, or where you have, areas that are not under direct pressure, and where you have a perverse incentive, where, you want your area to come under pressure to be able to access the finance of mechanisms like JRED. And so creating something that is acknowledging those areas that are well protected, that are doing, that are able to incorporate carbon in that way, we think is the gap, and is the piece of the puzzle. We're playing with and I've seen a report coming out last week from the Forests and Leaders Climate Partnership on the different instruments, and they're using puzzles as the image for how it's put together. And I think it's a very fitting image. It's not one instrument that will be, the silver bullet on forest. It is combining different instruments, and it's making sure that you have the right one for the different spaces. And in particular, I think for a lot of our forest countries, payment for ecosystem services and bringing it back to the community. So to link back to the question, which is how do you go about, making sure that this is hitting the ground and this is providing a just transition, those types of instruments that will get the money into the population, the indigenous peoples more directly, the local communities, the smallholder farmers that are the ones who are there and protecting the forest. We think that this is a very important leg of the process, that it does bring it back to those to those communities, to those peoples. And so that's why, Brazil is investing a lot in creating the Tropical Forest Forever Fund facility. And this is something that President Lula very proudly announced last week at the summit of the NDCs, that Brazil would be the first contributor to that. So Brazil will bring $1 billion. And this is really a shift in the way that our countries have been doing. It's always relying, on developed countries to put the money on the table. But we believe in it very much and wanted to show that we're not only, talking about it, but that we want to bring a concrete contribution for our forest countries, and so have been the first one to contribute to it ourselves. We hope that this, again, it won't be the last, it won't be the silver bullet, but it can mobilize a very significant portion of what we need for this piece in particular, connecting back to the communities. And so it is something that is very dear for us, and it's something that we think can make a real difference in the space.
Good. Great, thank you. We seem to have temporarily lost Gary, but I'm sure he'll come right back. I wanted to pick up on our final question, but also connect it back to the remark that you opened with in commenting on New York. And you said that there was this shift to pragmatism, to just focusing on delivering solutions and getting away from some of the big picture stuff. Maybe I'm paraphrasing a little oversimplistically, but I think it's so interesting the way what you described happened in New York really mirrors what's happening in boardrooms with respect to the climate transition. This audience is made up of board members who are pondering how they can do their jobs better as directors and incorporate climate transition priorities, notwithstanding some of the changes in context that we are experiencing right now. And that is in large part driven, well, in part driven by, the focus shifting to geopolitical security. We know that. But it's also very heavily influenced by what's happening in the United States at a political level. And in particular, I refer back to COP26 in Glasgow and the emergence at that COP of several initiatives, in particular, those that were encompassed within the GFANZ, Global Financial Alliance for Net Zero, where you had associations of banks, asset managers, asset owners, meaning pension funds and insurers, insurance companies, all in collectively collaborating to raise the bar on industry practice in a way that, to connect back to the point you made earlier, none of us can do this alone. None of us can really reach the level of achievement by working alone. We have no choice but to work across, sectors, and also across relationships between suppliers and customers. And one of the hurdles that has been thrown in the way of these initiatives and has really chilled collaboration to the point where many institutions have withdrawn from these associations is the abusive application of enforcement actions in the antitrust space. So in other words, accusing banks, asset managers, and others of breaching competition law by working together. Now, you may know, but I'm not sure necessarily that our audience knows, that several competition authorities have come out with guidance, technical guidance, to reassure companies and financial institutions that, subject to certain very basic, principles of not collaborating to share pricing information and so forth, the usual stuff around, avoiding antitrust violations, it is perfectly acceptable to work collaboratively to advance sustainability objectives, including in particular climate objectives. So I would really like to invite you to comment on how Brazil and this COP is what it is thinking about the question of promoting collaboration, notwithstanding these pressures that we are all facing. And I can tell you that as directors in the boardroom, the fact that our investors have suddenly gone much quieter on the questions that they used to raise with us for fear of being accused of collusive behavior is really making it more difficult for us in the boardroom to do what we should be doing. So over to you. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
No, that's appreciated. And that's not an easy question, right? And indeed, I was working for the UK government during the Glasgow COP. I was working here with the perspective of how Brazil would engage in that. It was a very different moment in time. It was a moment when, people were ready to come to the stage and say, I am committing to net zero. It's different today, but that doesn't mean that it is not there. I think it is really a shift to a much more pragmatic view of things. And maybe the feeling that I got, there was one of the solutions dialogues that was exactly talking about the transition plans of the companies. It is about what makes business sense in the midterm. So actually, I'd love to hear from you. I mean, the colleagues that are here, and this is something that we do want to. It's honest when we say that we want to build in listening mode, because we think that COP should be a platform that is servicing the space of action, right? It should be in service of you, of this, of the boardroom members, and how can it be useful for you to accelerate your investments, your decisions on this. But I think that it's shifted in that way, that it's not the moment when we're being very, vocal and bold about this, but there is an economic narrative behind it. There's an economic logic behind it. If the world is going, and even with, backtracking on the political side, you can still see the direction of travel of investments going a certain way. So the decisions need to become about what it is that it makes sense for us looking into the future. Where do we want to bet in the way that the transition is happening, regardless of the ideological piece of that? And there is a strong case on mitigation, and we see the transition happening on renewables, on energy. The direction of travel is there. So there's a point about how do we, and a lot of it has to do with efficiency as well. So it's good business sense decision of, raising the efficiency of your production process, or, reducing your cost on energy, reducing your reliance on things that, might be shifting over time. But there's an even stronger case about the physical risks that are threatening all of the businesses. And this is something that we've heard from a lot of companies in New York, that a lot of them are individually doing this assessment of what are the physical risks to their value chains over time. And how do we incorporate that, but that there is a usefulness in doing this in an aggregated manner across value chains. So that level of collaboration that is about, what are the solutions for you to create more resilient value chains across the board, because there are things that aren't within the gifts of the company, but there are things that can be much better played if it is played collectively, about public policy and different instruments that can be put together. So I think that's a much more mature discussion at this point. It is about that collaboration that isn't that isn't impelling on antitrust laws, but there is about what are the solutions that make your value chain more efficient on the one side, that make your reduce cost over time and position your company in the way where the economy is going, and on the other side protecting ourselves and creating more resilient business models that will resist the changes that we will have with climate change happening. So I'm quite more excited about that piece of the discussion, and it connects a lot to adaptation. That is something that's been hard to mobilize investments to. But as we evidence more those physical risks to the businesses, I think that this creates a whole new space that is quite interesting and emerging.
All right, thank you very much. I think I'm going to turn it over now to Gary, because he's going to do the wrap up.
Well, thank you very much. First of all, I just want to be sure you can hear me, because I got dropped from the call. But no, I think what you've said is extremely compelling, and it leaves us hungry, looking forward to what's going to happen at the COP in Belém. We've for the longest time had a kind of a firewall between sort of the dealings with the multilateral process, the convention, the implementing agreements. And with the thought of that's the realm of governments, really, rather than the private sector. But in the intervening COPs, the more recent COPs, we see that with what's going on with the UN, we see a great deal of use of the language, more of investment, more of collaboration, more of South-South, the idea that you cannot, isolate different sources of funding, that there needs to be blending, and that this blending needs to be different and allow for different combinations of finance to work in different national circumstances and situations. But overall, as I don't see any other questions, I would like to thank you very, very much, Bruna. And before we let you go, is there one final message that you would like to give our audience? They've sat through 10 experts before you, and we decided to go out with a bang, end with the best. Is there something a message that you would like to give to our audience to cap off this global climate governance summit?
No, thank you so much for that. And it's really impressive that you've been doing this for almost, 10 hours. Is that it? That's a lot. And it shows that, the interest is there and that there is a real point behind what we're doing. It's not, about defending something for the sake of it, but it is because it does has material implications for the businesses. It has material implications for the bottom line. So I'm very excited actually to hear that you've been talking about this for the last 10 hours. And actually, I hope that you can give us contributions in Belém. As I've said, right, as in this final message, it is all about building it together. It is not something that, please don't expect Brazil to come with a silver bullet to the table and just solve everyone's problems. That's not going to happen. And it's not useful, right? That is something that we need to build collectively. And so hopefully this spirit that you're bringing, looking at your own boardrooms and what needs to happen in your boardrooms, that is something that you can bring to Belém. So I would leave this invitation. Do come to Belém. I think there's a question, are we supposed to go or are we not supposed to go? Do come to Belém. I think that these voices, they're really important in shaping the discussion, shaping what you need from the negotiators, what it is that you need coming out of the negotiations, but not only the negotiations, what is it that you need coming out of the country regulations? How does it help your, investment decisions in that way? And what can you bring to the table in order to create, your piece of the puzzle in this process? So I think those are the conversations that we're very interested in having in Belém about the concrete solutions that are already there in the different sectors of the economy, on energy, on agriculture, on forest sector and bioeconomy. That's something that we're quite interested in, on industry. What are the solutions that you have that you think can be scaled up if we unblock some of these things that are locked? And so this is not a conversation that we will end in Belém. This is a conversation that we hope to start in Belém and that we hope that will continue over time, and that it becomes, that COPs become a space for the boardrooms also to constantly be talking about what are those blockages that we need to unlock to be able to progress faster on all of these things. So we do hope that you will bring your insights. And maybe the last point is that there a lot of these discussions on the practical side have been shaped by the initiatives that come from the developed countries, simply because of capacity and I think, the ability to put these things on the table. And we do hope that at this COP, we begin to put much more of the voice of the Global South on the table, and the initiatives and the vision, and the vision in particular of what makes a difference in our different regional contexts, our different realities, that we need to pay better attention to. So hopefully, you will be able to shape this discussion with us and help us in the spirit of the Multiro. So you're invited to come and shape this together.
Muito obrigado. Thank you very, very much, Bruna Cerqueira, for joining us and for capping off this last panel in our global summit. With that, I'd like to thank Bruna for her time and wish her all the very best at the COP in Belém. Also, a big thank you to Karina Litvack for helping me out with this tag team moderation, as it were. And so with that, we've actually come to the end of a day. If you need to sign off, please do. It's all left to me, I suppose, to give some closing remarks to end our global summit here today.